James Martin, and I'm a Jesuit priest and author of The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything. Becoming a Jesuit is kind of a long process. You start as a Jesuit novice, which is 2 years in a place called the novitiate, and you do a combination of prayer and working with the poor. In the middle of all that 2 years, you do a 30-day silent retreat based on what are known as the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius Loyola, which is kind of an imaginative placing yourself in the gospel scenes and sort of accompanying Jesus through the gospel scenes imaginatively. After the novitiate, you take what are called your simple vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. After that, you do what's called first studies, which is a combination of philosophy and theology. And then following that, you do 3 years of full-time work, which is called, in the Jesuits, a regency. Most Jesuits like to teach. They'll teach in a high school somewhere. I worked overseas in the Jesuit Refugee Service, helping refugees in East Africa start small businesses for themselves. So after that 3 years is done, you go to theology studies, and you 3 or 4 years of theology studies, and if you're a priest, you get ordained at the end. There's Jesuit brothers as well, people who are Jesuits but are not called to the priesthood. And then after ordination, you work full-time for a couple of years. I'm working in a Catholic magazine. And finally, at the end of probably 5 or 6 years after that, you take what are called your final vows. So the whole process is pretty long. It took me 21 years to become a Jesuit, which I think was a little too long for my taste. But that's pretty average. It takes about 20 years to become a full-fledged Jesuit. I like to say it's like being a made man in the mafia, or getting tenure at a university, or becoming a partner. You know, you've been in for a while, but you're finally fully accepted. So it's a pretty long process. Poverty is one of the 3 vows that we take. We take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And initially Saint Ignatius Loyola, when he had his conversion experience, he was injured in a battle and was taken home to recuperate and started to think about doing something else with his life. He became very ascetical and gave up everything and really lived like a hermit. Lived in a cave, let his fingernails grow long, his hair grow long. And ultimately he realized that this wasn't really doing him much good, and he needed to moderate some of this. He ended up going back to school to learn, and so he thought, well, Jesuits should be free of material possessions, but they don't have to live, like they're hermits, like they're living in a cave and eating twigs and things like that. It's not a complete poverty. So Jesuit poverty is really about freedom. It's about the freedom of not owning things. It's about the freedom of living simply. And it's also about the freedom to not let any possessions come in between you and God. At the same time, it's supposed to help us identify with the poor. We do a lot of work with the poor, and we're supposed to try to live as close as possible to what St. Ignatius calls a family of slender means, people who don't have a lot. And also, it's supposed to model Christ. Jesus, when he lived on the earth, was living very simply, as a very simple man. And so those are the 3 things. It frees us up for service. It makes it so we don't have a lot of possessions to kind of like tie us down. It helps us identify with the poor, and it's an imitation of Christ. It's really trying to follow Christ more closely. Yeah, chastity is the most difficult thing to explain about religious life. Most people think it's crazy or unhealthy or unnatural. After the sex abuse crisis, people think that the sex abuse crisis came from chastity or from celibacy. But it's really, as I see it, a different way to love. It's certainly not for everybody. Clearly, most people are called to romantic love and married lives and having children. But for some of us, it works. And really what it is, it's loving many people freely and deeply. You're not attached to just one person. You don't have an exclusive relationship, so you're free to love many people, which is not to say that people who are married or are in a romantic relationship can't love many people. It's just to say that this is what works best for people in religious orders. And I find it very freeing. I find people can be freer with me in a sense. When I become close friends with somebody, they're not wondering, is he becoming friends because of sex? Does he have an ulterior motive, something like that. Men and women can feel comfortable with you. And really, in a practical level, it makes you a lot more mobile. You're not in a sense, worried about what your wife or husband is going to be thinking about you moving or taking a new job. So it can be very freeing, but it really freaks people out. I mean, chastity really, in a culture that values sex, and rightly so much, it really disturbs people. But I think, for those people who are called to it, it can work very well if you live it in a healthy way, meaning if you have friends and have healthy work and a healthy prayer life. So I'm all for it, but it's not for everybody. I worked for GE for 6 years, and I had studied at the Wharton School of Business beforehand, before entering GE. And after about 6 years, I started to realize that this really wasn't for me. Business was a real vocation, as it were, for a lot of my friends, and I just got more and more miserable. The workload got more difficult. As anyone who works in the corporate world knows, it can be really stressful. And I saw some friends of mine really enjoying the work, while I just seemed to get bored by it. At the same time, I was getting all these stomach problems and sort of stress-related illnesses. One night I came home dead tired after this long day of work, and I sort of plopped down on our couch and turned on the TV, and there was this PBS documentary about a guy named Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk, a cloistered monk, and I had never heard of him, and the documentary really just captivated me. The look on his face just spoke this great sense of joy and peace and calm and consolation, and it really called out to me. And that was so interesting, that one documentary, that I went out and purchased his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, which is pretty well known in Catholic circles. I'd never heard of it. I devoured it. I read it in a couple of nights, and I really couldn't get it out of my mind that that's what I wanted to do, something like what he did. I wasn't particularly religious. I was Catholic, but I wasn't super Catholic. I'd never thought of anything like that before. And I read a lot about Thomas Merton, and one day I went up to my parish priest and I said, I think I'd be interested in being a priest, which was kind of weird because he had never even, met me before. And he said, well, you should talk to the local diocese, and you might want to talk to the Jesuits who were up the street at Fairfield University in Connecticut. That was the only connection I had to the Jesuits. So I visited the Jesuits at Fairfield. They gave me some, vocational literature, kind of promotional literature about the Jesuits, and I read it and thought, this is crazy. I actually ripped it up, threw it away, and thought, this is insane. This is not who I am. But I read some more and continued to read. Around the same time, I started to go to a psychologist because of all these stress-related stomach problems as a result of work. And so I'm reading and thinking and going to the psychologist at the same time. And finally, one day he said to me, well, you're in this business world and you don't seem very happy, so what would you do if you could do anything you wanted to do? And I thought for a moment and I said, oh, I'd be a Jesuit priest. And he said, well, why don't you? And I thought, yeah, why don't I? So it made sense, and I thought, well, this is really something that I'm actually interested in. Why am I doing something that I dislike, So I called the Jesuits, and they didn't know who I was, and I said, I'm ready to enter. And they were nice enough to sort of start me on the application process, which took a couple months, but a couple months later I was in. So it was pretty rushed, but I have to say, looking back on it, it was probably, well, it was the best decision I've ever made. Well, I have to say Saint Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, who lived from 1491 to 1556, his spirituality, which can be summarized as finding God in all things, or being a contemplative in action, the person who has a sense of awareness in the midst of a very busy world, has really changed the way I live my life. I think, for me, Saint Ignatius is kind of the model for all Jesuits. But I don't just like Jesuit saints. I also like Saint Therese of Lisieux, who was a 19th century Carmelite nun who lived what she called her little way, which was basically doing small things with great love for God. I love Blessed John the 23rd, who was Pope from 1958 to 1963, because he was so funny, basically. One joke from John the 23rd, a journalist asked him once how many people work in the Vatican, and he said about half of them. So, I mean, he shows that you can be someone with a sense of humor and be a saint. And then finally, Thomas Merton, the fellow whose book I read, who kind of got me started on religious life. So those are my, I'd say, top four. You don't need to believe in God to find his insights useful. It helps to understand the totality of his message, because Jesuit spirituality without God or without Jesus, will only make partial sense. But that being said, Saint Ignatius knew that people were on different paths in their life, to God, and different paths in general. And so many of the insights are really useful to people who are not only devout believers, but even doubtful seekers, people who are agnostic or atheist. For example, he talks about how to make decisions, living freely, how to be a good friend, how to work well, how to be in a healthy relationship with somebody. So there's a lot of things that you can take from the way of St. Ignatius that are applicable to anybody. But really, to understand it in its totality, you have to see it as sort of a path to God. So I like to say that anyone can benefit from the way of St. Ignatius, but to get to the final end, you really do have to keep your eyes focused on God. A lot of Ignatian spirituality talks about desire, and that's sort of a bad word in some spiritual circles, because some people equate it with just selfish wants, right? Like, I want a new car, I want a new iPhone, I want a new PC, something like that. Or they think of it as sexual desire, which is, oh my gosh, God forbid we should talk about sexual desire. I mean, that's healthy, right? But desire on an even deeper level is the desire that we have to be who we are, to be our true selves, and the desire for God. And there's also desires that lead us to our vocations and what we want to do in life. So, for example, a married couple might discover their vocations through desire. So the desire for sexual intimacy, for emotional intimacy, for a sort of connectedness. I mean, that brings them together. People understand that in terms of desire. Desire works the same way in terms of our jobs and our vocations. Someone who is interested in video might be interested in it because they feel this attraction to it. It's really interesting. They feel this desire for it. Someone who's a doctor might find talking about medicine and the body and things like that just really attractive. So desire is a really important thing to pay attention to. And ultimately, our desires, I believe, our deepest desires are God's desires for us, really. And the deepest desires we have to be our true self, to really live out who we're meant to be and what we're meant to do, are the ways that God has of drawing us to happiness, and also ways that God has of drawing us, I think, to fulfill God's desires for the world. So I don't think we should be too hard on desire in the spiritual life or in any part of life. Yeah, I don't think we can find true happiness, this side of life. I mean, there's always going to be certain suffering and struggles. Everybody has problems in their life. But I think you can attain a great sense of joy and peace if your life is centered on God. Now, that sounds really cheesy. What does that mean? It means, in the Ignatian way of looking at things, the Jesuit way of looking at things, a lot of freedom and detachment from things that keep you from being connected to God. It means being grateful for the things that are blessings in your life. It means, as a contemplative in action, being aware of all the blessings you have in life. But a certain amount of suffering is inevitable in anyone's life. I think any religion, any really healthy religion, will tell you that. So, full joy, I think, is only achieved with God, in the afterlife, God willing. But I think you can experience a lot of joy in your life today on earth. Thank God. Sometimes you're on shows where people are aggressive or are confrontational, and it's important to remember always to be charitable. Because, when I'm talking, it's not just representing me or talking about my book. I'm also, for better or worse, representing the church. And so if I come off as being argumentative or mean or snappish or whatever, then people will say, oh, look, the Catholic Church, once again, they're being whatever. So charity is the first thing. I sometimes get nervous about the topics that people choose to bring up. You never know what they're going to bring up. But on Colbert, it's a lot of fun. I mean, he himself is a Catholic, so I know that he understands what I'm talking about. He's funny. One of the great challenges of being on that show is just not laughing. I mean, he's so outrageous sometimes and so unpredictable that the things he says just make me laugh. One time I was on, and we were talking about the recession and how people find God in the midst of difficult times. And I said that we're sometimes more open to God's activity in our lives when we're more vulnerable, which is true because, when our defenses are down, we can let God in more easily, which happens when people are sick or when they're, going through difficult times. And he said, "You make God sound like an opportunistic disease." And I thought, I guess I do. But it was hard not to laugh because it was so silly. But yeah, I really enjoy being on the show. On the one hand are people who say that anti-Catholicism is just as bad as anti-Semitism or homophobia or racism. It's not, clearly. It's not as virulent and not as prevalent. On the other hand are people that say it doesn't exist at all, but it does, basically. I think a lot of portrayals of nuns and priests on TV and in the movies are stereotypical. Post-sex abuse crisis, frequently when you see a priest show up on a TV cop show, he's usually a pedophile. Nuns are usually portrayed as like ninnies, basically, or stupid. I mean, I always say here are women who kind of built the Catholic healthcare system in the United States and ran universities, but when they come on TV, they're portrayed as being idiots, basically. So there's some subtle anti-Catholicism in that. I think, you hear people taking pot shots at priests for being celibate or being pedophiles or being insane or whatever. So I think there's a lot of stuff that slides by, on TV and in the movies that would never be allowed to happen with other groups. I mean, if you portrayed a rabbi or an imam like that, people would rightfully complain. But in a way, I think because we live in a largely Protestant culture, I think because of the sex abuse crisis, and I think because of, some suspicion about the Vatican and Catholic theology, in a sense, anti-Catholicism is more acceptable. In fact, one person once called it the last acceptable prejudice. So it's there, but I think we need to keep in context exactly what that means. It's not as virulent as some other stereotypes are, but it is present. I think it's gotten worse because of the sex abuse crisis. I think things are said about priests and celibacy, which are, stereotypes, basically. So you take a very small population of priests who have committed these crimes and you magnify it and you say, well, that applies to all priests. And I read stuff in mainstream newspapers and on TV, and you hear jokes and things like that. And, as a priest myself, who keeps his vows, it's offensive, basically. And I often say to people, would you say this about rabbis? Would you say this about imams? And the answer is no, but somehow people think because of the sex abuse crisis, it's okay to stereotype all Catholics. All Catholics are like this, all bishops are like this, all priests are like this, and which would never fly for any other religious group. So I just think it's basically unfair. I think he's really started to do some really important things. I think his meeting with victims during his visit to the United States was historic and really unprecedented. I think, though, that there's always more that can be done for the sex abuse crisis. In 2002, the U.S. bishops met in Dallas to formulate their zero tolerance policy, which I think was necessary. But I think that, the clerical culture that gave rise to that sex abuse crisis, which is essentially, a few very sick men who were moved around from parish to parish, by some bishops, for fear of, quote unquote, causing scandal. That's more of a cultural type thing. I think that needs to be addressed. So I think what the church needs to do is to have a culture of much more transparency. And frankly, when these guys do these things, they need to be kicked out. And in the United States, that's already happened. So I don't think you'll see it in the United States. You might hear reports of ones that happened, maybe in the 60s and 70s, but, going ahead, there is this zero tolerance policy. I think other countries are starting to realize that now, what needs to be done. It really needs to be just sort of taken out root and branch and blamed on the right sources. It has nothing to do with celibacy, it has nothing to do with, gay clergy, anything like that. Neither of those two things lead to pedophilia. It has to do, I think, with this culture of secrecy and the wrong-headed notion that we shouldn't, quote unquote, cause scandal by revealing some of these things. So I hope the Catholic Church really takes the lead in showing other organizations about this because, most sex abuse takes place in families. There's sex abuse in schools, there's sex abuse in children's organizations like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. So I think that the Catholic Church has an opportunity here to really take the lead and be in the vanguard of preventing children from being abused. Glenn Beck's comment really betrayed, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel. Jesus in the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew basically says that the litmus test for how we're going to be judged at the end of our lives is not what church we pray in, how we pray, even how often we go to church. It's how we treat the poor. I mean, it's pretty cut and dried, If you want to enter into heaven, treat the poor well. Now, social justice is a way of looking at what keeps people poor. And as the church in its 2,000-year history has reflected on Jesus' commandment to serve the poor and love the poor, it's realized that we need to look at what keeps them poor. It's not enough to just give someone a handout. As important as that is, it's important to look at what keeps the people poor. So someone told me the other day the gospel story of the Good Samaritan, where the guy sees someone by the side of the road who's been beaten, and he takes care of him. He brings him back to an inn. He dresses his wounds. He gives him money for staying overnight in the inn. Someone said to me, today, we'd also be looking at why that road is dangerous. What is it that makes that road dangerous? How can we fix the situations that lead for crime and things like that? So that's what social justice is. It's basically working for a just society. Now, how anybody can be against that is beyond me, frankly. He compared people who support social justice to Stalin and Hitler. And I just found that, frankly, outrageous. There have been people other than me that have talked about this, and he's responded by saying, well, I didn't mean this. What I meant was this. I meant that charity's okay as long as it's not sponsored by the government. But, once again, how else does the community respond socially other than through governmental policies? I mean, you can do things individually, you can do things in church, but I mean, we have all sorts of public works, in terms of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and even like public transportation. I mean, that in a sense is providing for the common good. So I still think he basically just doesn't like the idea of helping the poor. And I think oftentimes this critique of social justice is really just a thinly veiled excuse for not wanting to deal with the poor. And a lot of people find the poor, as Pope John Paul said, irksome intruders, into our comfortable life. But, what good is the gospel if it doesn't disturb you? Suppose it disturb you. Yeah, it's very hip to be spiritual, but not religious. Almost everybody I know says they're spiritual. Now, that's good. I mean, spiritual is good. Spiritual means that you have a relationship with God. Spiritual means that you connect with God, that spirituality is an important part of your life, that you try to lead a good life, you try to be in concert with what your relationship with God tells you, which is terrific. I mean, you have to have that. Religious, on the other hand, in current parlance, is bad because that seems to say that, oh, I believe in this organization that has all these hidebound dogmas and beliefs, and I would never be able to belong to an organization that tells me what to think, things like that. The problem with being spiritual but not religious is that you're not part of a community, in a sense. And so there's no one to sort of bump up against to tell you when you might be a little off track. As well, you're not really able to connect in your spiritual life with other people. There was a great saying from Isaac Hecker, who was a 19th century American priest, and he said religion enables us to connect and correct. So we connect with other people. We're naturally social animals, right? And we like to worship in common. That makes sense. We connect with one another, and we're corrected. If I have a direct line to God, right, that means that by definition, anything I think or say is from God, right? And that's, as we know, a problem. So being spiritual without being religious means that you're lacking kind of the wisdom of the community, as well as the support of the community, when you're sort of struggling. Being religious without being spiritual is just as bad. Being religious without being spiritual just means all you're doing is following the rules. You're just following the rules, you're just listening to the community, and you're not reflecting on things yourself. So the one thing is what Jesus was warning against, being religious without being spiritual, to some of the religious authorities of his day. What I'm warning against is being spiritual without being religious, which is much more common today. So I think it's not an either or, I think it's a both and. The worst career advice I've ever had was when I was at the Wharton School studying business, and I went to my faculty advisor, and Wharton students are supposed to be focused really on the business, and I said that I would be interested in taking an American poetry class, and he said, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." He said, "Don't take an American poetry class. It's a waste of time. No one will care if you ever studied American poetry when you want to get a job at GE. So I would strongly advise you not to do that unless you want to be thought, not serious about your job." So fortunately, I didn't take his advice, and it's one of the few courses I remember very well from school. The best career advice I've ever gotten was from that psychologist who said, what would you do if you could do anything you wanted to do? I think that's a question I ask a lot of people, and it's very clarifying for people because frequently we have these expectations put on us by family, by friends, what you should do. A friend of mine called that shoulding all over yourself, S-H-O-U-L-D-I-N-G. Rather than saying, what are my desires? What do I like? What gets me excited? And I tend to think that you will do better at things that you're really interested in because you're going to spend more time with it, you're going to read about it outside of work, and you'll be enthusiastic about it. So when I was at GE working in business, I realized that the people who were going to do well were the people who loved it. My friends would read the Wall Street Journal and say, "Oh, this is fascinating." And I would say, "How can you read that stuff?" And he'd say, "Oh, this is fantastic. How can you not read it?" And so this notion of, following your desires, I think is really important. And, what would you do if you could do anything you wanted to do is probably the best career advice or the best question I've ever been asked about my career.